Institutional blindness, the lack of long-term vision, and the lack of a sense of reality among the elites rarely come from simple ignorance, contrary to what many people think. It comes from rational incentives and organizational routines that make it dangerous, or at the very least useless, to bring bad news to the top of the power structure. They have chains of command with different levels of information, subjective evaluation, and reputation. In the language of economic and organizational theory, this is a combination of principal-agent problems, or what happens when there is a conflict of interests and objectives between the party that delegates authority, which is the principal, and the other that acts on their behalf, the agent. And also by the strategic transmission of information that, under certain conditions, turns into stable equilibria of silence, information filtering, and denial. Mutual trust between leaders, which is understood as predictability, loyalty, and reciprocity of protection, can improve coordination when we face uncertainties. But, and this is the main point of the video, it is also what creates psychological and political costs for internal cohesion. In models, when the sender and the receiver have misaligned preferences, informative communication generally tends to degrade, getting worse over time and as it is transmitted. The greater this misalignment, the disagreement, the coarser and less detailed the message is. In incentive and career models, subordinates who are afraid of appearing incompetent or disloyal tend to imitate what their superior wants to hear, leading to conformist reports and delaying corrections. So we have a dilemma that happens among large companies, but incredibly, it happens even more and is replicated in the management of nations and empires throughout history. This is the dilemma where the mid-level employee must report everything to their superior, running the risk of appearing incompetent, like that guy who doesn't solve anything, who only brings problems and only holds everyone else back. And because of that, probably being dismissed or even punished precisely for being the guy who never solves anything and only makes things worse. Or should he filter things, bringing only what the boss wants to hear, just the good news, making himself look like an efficient employee who only brings good results, and with that, gets promotions and benefits? Well, if you use LinkedIn, the most toxic and crappy social network, you've probably come across some super genius, superhuman who knows all the secrets of the universe, extremely positive and hyped up with a very punchable face. So, according to him, you have a third option, which is the magic secret of business success and governance, which is to solve problems before taking it to the boss or bring the problem with possible solutions. This sounds great to people with limited intellectual capacity who are impressed by catchphrases and need to be motivated by self-help books. Because in real life, when you deal with aspects that involve a multitude of factors, and when we talk about big companies, or even worse, nations and empires, we simply have to accept that there are problems that either depend on others and there's nothing you can do, or that simply have no solution, because it's a force of nature, so to speak. So you, inevitably, no matter how smart and skilled you are, will end up, sooner or later, facing the two initial options I mentioned. Either tell the truth and risk being punished, or filter the truth and get bonuses. At the sociological and political level, filtering is also reinforced by an oligarchization, which is when you have closed leadership, closed recruitment, information selection, and informational cascades, which is when rational agents follow previous decisions even when they have private signals to the contrary. These phenomena help explain why peripheral signals persist and can be underestimated by the leadership until the breaking point when there are no more restrictions. If we apply this idea to today's Brazil, the risk now is not just an inevitable and rapid collapse, but the possibility of opaque zones gradually emerging. In institutions with high decision-making centralization, based on politicized appointments, dependence on coalitions, and weak effective protection for whistleblowers. The architecture of coalition presidentialism, as is the case in Brazil, emphasizes negotiation and the distribution of resources and positions. What then creates incentives for only pleasant messages to reach the leadership and for intermediaries controlling what information gets through? Trust between leaders usually arises from four socio-political mechanisms that, when combined, tend to produce information filtering and denial. The first mechanism is the network of loyalty and patronage. Access to resources and positions depends on personal relationships and reciprocity. In general, this means cooperating, that is, being loyal, because that preserves future income. To disagree is the same as defecting, that is, bringing bad news that undermines the coalition can lead to that person being excluded. The result is that information that threatens the group is discouraged, even when it's true. Evidence on clientelism and coalitions shows how this kind of political exchange organizes incentives and disciplines behaviors. The second mechanism is the selection of cadres by politicians. The greater the insecurity of the leadership, the greater the incentive to appoint loyal agents who reduce the risk of conspiracy, even if this decreases technical competence and the quality of information. There are formal models for this dilemma in authoritarian environments, in which the choice of loyalty leads to worse state capacity and increases the likelihood of mistakes that lead to catastrophe. The third mechanism is shared socialization, where elites often share schools, careers, professional clubs, and common languages, which strengthens trust among them, but also creates echo chambers and reduces interpretive diversity. In other words, when I say echo chambers, I mean that people keep repeating what others say just to be accepted within the group. And finally, the fourth gear, which is control of the channel, where the intermediary controls what reaches the top and can curate. Let's put it this way: reports to protect reputations, avoiding punishments, and thus maintaining his access to these leaders. The principal agent theory, which I mentioned earlier, suggests that when actions are difficult to observe, agents then have more room to manipulate the narratives. In strategic communication, this misalignment between the preferences of the message sender, such as ministers and advisors, and the receiver, the president, the king, the emperor, or whoever else it may be, like the head of a company, reduces the amount of information conveyed. The message considered the best possible for the sender is the one that preserves his relationship with the leader and minimizes his own risk, not the one that is most accurate or closest to reality. From a psychological and organizational point of view, two amplifiers are common: escalation of commitment, that is, persisting in order not to admit failure, and loss aversion, when admitting a crisis means losses of power and status. In both cases, they increase the value of denial, especially when the elite has already invested its reputation in a certain strategy. And we have no shortage of examples, and here I have selected 4 historical cases to show a pattern that always repeats itself. Elites in dense networks of trust and dependence. Whether it's a court, a single political party, a closed cabinet, a military junta, a cartel, whatever it may be. They tend to prefer narratives that preserve internal coalitions, even when the situation around them is only getting worse. In other words, they close themselves off in a bubble and can't, or worse, don't want to see the reality outside of it anymore. Let's call this bubble isolation, and just for the record, I chose 4 examples, but don't be fooled, because in reality these patterns repeat almost always throughout human history. In the Western Roman Empire, isolation here doesn't mean the absence of signs, but rather the difficulty in turning scattered signs into coordinated action. Local elites in the Roman Empire had incentives to protect their fiscal privileges and status, while the imperial administration depended on a very complex bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is a fertile environment for information filtering. Studies on the Roman government near its end make it clear that administrative complexity and court politics were part of the problem of coordination and fiscal extraction. Sources from that time record criticism of aristocratic culture and self-deception. For example, documents by Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian from that time, describe Rome's self-image of greatness in contrast with decadent practices. And in the letters of Sidonius Apollinaris, bishop and public official of the Roman Empire, he records the shrinking of Roman territory in the face of barbarian powers, revealing how notable provincials tried to reconcile local survival with symbolic loyalty to the center. The Roman elite at the time did not believe that Rome could ever be invaded and that the empire could fall even just a few weeks before Attila the Hun arrived at the gates of Rome. He arrived quickly, and they could no longer deny reality, but it was already too late. Another example that I think deserves more attention from Brazilians is that of the Qing dynasty from 1839 in the First Opium War until 1911 with its fall. It combines the external shock of wars and unequal treaties with the internal shock of rebellions and fiscal crisis. The literature on Chinese court politics shows how internal disputes and reputational incentives shape decisions before and during the First Opium War. A clear example of strategic information in civil service and bureaucracy. A primary source is the letter attributed to Lin Zexu to Queen Victoria of England, which revealed that the elite, Qin, still interpreted the relationship with European powers with a moral and hierarchical grammar, with China still being the center of the world, where external conflicts could be resolved by ethical appeals to sovereign authority and by the expectation of civilizational reciprocity. By presuming that the British monarchy would have both the willingness and the ability to suppress the opium trade for moral reasons, Lin demonstrated enormous institutional ignorance and a lack of understanding of reality. He did not realize that the British Empire operated under an imperial commercial logic and economic interests that were far removed from the Chinese emperor's idea of reality. This failure of cultural and political translation shows the strategic blindness typical of elites formed within a stable reality that no longer corresponds to the larger reality. In Iran more recently, with the fall of the Pahlavi monarchy during the Iranian Revolution, is another classic example of informational failure. Overconfidence and selective repression because the Iranian leadership relied on security reports and external allies, while the ability to read the religious coalition and the mobilization of the masses was limited by secular models and political filters. Public security officials and Iranian government agents only brought good news to the king, who didn't believe that the situation was so bad among the population. And this got worse when he had access to CIA intelligence documents that also showed that the situation was not that serious. A United States intelligence document from that period states that the country was not in a revolutionary or even a pre-revolutionary situation, showing how formal assessments can produce incompetence and delay adaptation. As a delayed response, the speech he made on television, where he also said he had heard the voice of the revolution when it was already too late, became a symbol of a concession perceived as insufficient. A case in which the signal of flexibility comes too late and instead of preventing the downfall ends up being seen as weakness. If he had negotiated with the revolutionaries earlier, he would most likely still be in power today. But since he didn't know the situation was so bad to the point of implosion, when he finally negotiated, it was already too late. There was nothing left for him to negotiate, and then it seemed like a sign of weakness. But nothing is more classic than the end of the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet collapse exposes a tension between reforms to reduce opacity, glasnost, perestroika, and the political fragmentation that this openness accelerates by revealing flaws and increasing disputes within the republics. A CIA report from the time discusses the debate over whether American intelligence did or did not anticipate the speed of the collapse, suggesting that even outside observers struggle with models that underestimate breaking points. In primary documentation, the minutes of the Soviet State Council meeting in October 1991 show actors with little time to analyze documents and trying to deal simultaneously with economic treaties, supply issues, and the design of a new union. The Soviet elites knew the situation was bad, but fueled by reports from advisors and directors, they believed it wasn't that bad. But those reports were either forged due to corruption issues or fabricated by public officials who didn't want to lose their jobs and wanted to appear as good employees. So, they believed they had a window of opportunity of something like 20 or 30 years to ease the situation in the Soviet Union. But in reality, all they had ahead of them were just a few months. And well, everyone already knows the result, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, the application to Brazil should not be made to project collapses by analogy, but to show that what we are seeing are plausible mechanisms of informational isolation in institutions where career incentives, coalitions, and data control can distort their reading of reality. In some cases, it's quite likely that part of the elite already knows that the situation is much worse than the other part of the elite knows, but doesn't want to pass on the information. In the executive branch, the coalition presidentialism model describes a system in which governability depends on multi-party coalitions with the distribution of positions and resources. And this is replicated in a reduced and adapted way in state governments and city halls. This creates political value for controlling internal narratives and reducing internal conflicts within coalitions, which, under certain circumstances, can benefit these intermediaries and the reports that were, let's say, manipulated to maintain support. Broadly speaking, the presidency or the main ministries depend on bureaucrats and appointees, the agents, to produce information and implement public policies. When metrics then are noisy or politicized, there is more room for adverse selection and moral hazard in reporting. In security and defense institutions, such as the armed forces and public security agencies, hierarchy and discipline can increase coordination, but they also raise the cost of dissent, that is, the cost for someone to present themselves as the dissenter. The literature on organizational culture, guided by information flow, suggests that high-risk organizations function better. When messengers are trained and when reporting failures is rewarded, which is exactly the opposite of cultures where messengers are punished and information is withheld. Even without importing models from one sector to another, this diagnosis is useful for thinking about early warning mechanisms and internal audits. And given the Brazilian culture of the generic politician and traditional political clans, the tendency is in general to punish those who bring bad news, even if it's true, and to reward those who bring good news, even when it's false. Because this, then, is interpreted by the leadership as loyalty, which explains why we see the total and absolute detachment from reality that Brazilian leaders have. And it doesn't matter whether they hold elected positions, like in the legislative and executive branches, or civil service positions, like in the judiciary and public prosecutor's office. In fact, it's even worse in civil service positions, given the total independence and lack of accountability to the public. The employees in these positions become cognitively isolated and completely lose track of what's happening outside their offices. Because usually the people who go to their offices are either intimidated by their authority or are there to ask for favors and end up sucking up to them. And most importantly, they don't know this. They always believe they are more aware of what's going on than those outside the system. Thank you everyone, that's all for today. Share this video with everyone you know to help Canal Geopolitica Mundial get some reach, since if it depended on YouTube, no one would even know this channel exists. So, your sharing is very important. Now, if you really like Canal Geopolitica Mundial and want to make sure it keeps existing, become a member. The price for becoming a member is basically the cost of a carton of milk, and you make sure I can keep bringing content to you, since if I depended on views, the channel would hardly have any reach at all. And its monetization is very, very low. More than 90% of the channel's revenue comes from members. So by becoming a member, you make sure Canal Geopolitica Mundial keeps existing. And in return, besides that, you also get access to several exclusive videos for members and early access to videos. There's the Empire series, Geopolitics of the Mongol Empire, Military History of China, Geopolitical History of the United States. There's a lot of stuff and more content is coming. There's even a course for members to gain more knowledge about geopolitics. Alright, so consider it. It's not expensive and it ensures the channel keeps going. Thank you all, take care and see you in the next video.